Okay, we're gonna call the meeting to order. Welcome, everyone. This is the February 20th meeting of the Jericho Planning Commission. I will just briefly review the agenda. Thank you very much for coming this evening and participating. Thanks for all the medication and for being here. Happy birthday, Heidi. Thank you. So tonight. Yeah, definitely. We'll have time for public comment. Then we are going to approve two sets of minutes from January 16th, February 6th. And then the highlight of the evening will be a presentation from our consultant, David White, who's here. Welcome, David. Thank you very much for coming. From Sterling Mountain Community Planning and Design. And his topic will be to review with us the form-based code as a concept, what it is, and then a little bit more particular as to how Jericho has implemented it. And this is basically the first step of the Planning Commission's task to update our village center zoning, which is funded by Bylaw Modernization grant that we received. That Linda successfully applied for on our behalf. Thank you, Linda. Then we're going to plan our time at town meeting, how we want to leverage the fact that there's lots of residents there. It's a good opportunity for engagement. We'll hear from Linda, the planner's report, and then any updates from other planning commission members, other business, and then we'll wrap up and plan for our next two meetings, March 5th, which we have a big question mark about because that's the same day as student day. And then March 19th, executive session, and then adjourn. Does anybody need to make any changes or have any comments or objections to the agenda? Okay. Then we'll move on to public comment. So we have people on the Zoom. If you're on the Zoom, if you would please use the raise hand feature, which is under the reactions button of the Zoom. And if we don't see you, you can just chime in after a few minutes. And people in the room, if you have any comments to share, we just ask that you be super brief because we have a big agenda. Does anybody here have anything they'd like to share with the Planning Commission? Nobody in the room. Anybody on the Zoom? Okay. Then the next task is to approve the minutes of January 16th. Do I have a motion to approve?
Motion to approve.
All right. Thank you. In a second.
Second.
Chris, thank you. Any discussion, edits, problems with the minutes of January 16th? Okay, so to approve, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Anyone opposed? Okay. Next are the meeting minutes of February 6th. Motion to approve. Motion to approve. Sarah, thank you. Second. Second. Wendy, thank you. Any discussion, edits, problems with the minutes? Okay, vote to approve. All those in favor? Aye. Anyone opposed? Any abstention?
I'm gonna abstain.
Okay, Chris and Wendy abstained from February 6th approval.
Did you hear Sabina, what she?
Yeah, well, I heard her on the first one. What about on the second one?
You muted, Sabina.
I'm
Not muted now.
Okay.
I said aye both times.
Great. Okay, thank you. All righty. David, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Floor is yours.
All right, so I've got a couple of presentations. The first one is really just about the project and the scope of the project. And the second one is more of an overview of zoning. And I'm sure you all did your homework and spent the whole weekend diving deeply into the zoning ordinance. So it'll be a complete review for you.
Hang on, let me get the share screen up on the Zoom. Okay.
Cool, you can go right to the next slide.
Looks like I saved it as a PDF. Is that gonna work
Yep,
for you?
that's perfect.
Okay,
Perfect. As Susan mentioned, the town of Jericho was the recipient of a bylaw modernization grant from the state. Earlier this year, you applied, I think it was in December, was the application deadline, something like that.
mhm,
And the purpose of the grant, as you articulated in your application, as well as the purpose behind the grant program, is really twofold. The first is to implement the recommendations of the new Jericho Town Plan that you're all intimately familiar with. Certainly that one of the principal elements of that plan are the recommendations of adopted by the select board in the housing resolution, but about creating pedestrian oriented mixed use centers, increasing housing choice and affordability, and removing unnecessary regulatory barriers in order to do those things. And the program itself, the Bylaw Modernization Grant Program, emphasizes the state's smart growth principles as tools and concepts and philosophies to follow in trying to achieve those kinds of objectives. Go to the next one. So just as a reminder of the Jericho Housing Resolution that was passed in 2023, approximately 30 new units a year for a total of 150 new housing units by 2028. That's the goal. And then that breaks it down into missing middle income housing types, for housing that's affordable to individuals and families low and very low incomes, perpetually affordable housing, as well as senior housing. So these are all different components of that overall goal of 150 units by 28. Okay, next slide. So the smart growth principles of the state and the bylaw modernization grant program is looking towards a guide or a toolkit that the state developed a couple of years ago called Enabling Better Places, a zoning guide for Vermont neighborhoods. So in following the outline of that particular document and looking at, we'll use that as our tool to look at the current regulations that Jericho has in place, as well as what the state's guide identifies as aspirational objectives, as well as aspirational standards and components of zoning bylaws. So in this guide, it looks at, not every place is the same. Our goals for every place isn't the same. It includes downtowns, village centers, neighborhoods, and I think that's it. I don't think they include rural areas. By and large, when we look at Jericho, we're looking at the village centers as the physical setting for the types of development patterns, the scale and intensity of development in Jericho's villages. The next slide. So that then translates into a couple of different zoning district types that are found in Jericho's zoning regulations. The character-based zoning that applies in Riverside. There are two character-based districts, Character District 3 and Character District 4. 4 is the blue, which is kind of the core, more mixed use part of the character-based zoning, and 3 is more residential. And it applies in the village, will apply in the village center district, which are found in Riverside outside of the character-based zones, Jericho Corners and Jericho Center. Next slide. As you know, Riverside is included in both. You have the character-based zoning, which is then surrounded by the village center zone. So these are the geographic areas that will be specifically focused on for this grant. Next slide. So Enabling Better Places guide then breaks down into the different kinds of standards and topics that we would want to be looking at in order to consider improvements to the regulations. These include dimensional standards, lot size, lot width, setback requirements and the like, parking standards, the kinds of uses that are allowed, either permitted or conditionally permitted in zoning districts, how accessory dwelling units are treated, the development review process itself, and street standards. Next slide. So again, as they apply in Jericho zoning, these are the kinds of things that we'll be looking at, both within the character-based zones and within the rest of the zoning in the village center districts. And then as far as the development review process is concerned, what are the application requirements? What's the review process? Who makes the decision? And based on what? So what are the standards? And then how are those standards being applied in individual development projects? Next slide. So this project has a limited scope and a limited budget. I know because I've already come up with several things that is like, oh, what about this? What about that? I know you are going to have lots of ideas and have some questions about other topics. And I would recommend that as we go through this process, we keep track of those things into some sort of a parking lot so that when we're working on the next phase of this effort, outside of what this grant is going to pay for, we can take those things on. Things like the boundaries of the zoning districts that we're talking about. That's not part of the current scope, but that's something that's logical for us to want to talk about and think about. Well, do they make sense as they are? Do they want to be expanded or shrunken in different locations? So we'll try to keep track of those things and figure out how do we go about tackling them in another round.
And I already built a spreadsheet to start capturing those. So if you have any ideas, you can send them to me by email if they're not, they don't pop up tonight. Just let me know.
Right. And maybe that's something, I don't know, if you share it in the shared folder that, when you have that 3 a.m. epiphany that you can't stop thinking about this one thing that keeps coming up, you could go and just write it down and relieve yourself of that burden and go back to sleep.
Well, we can't share it online because that with everybody.
Oh, you could write.
So that's why it has to come to me first. But you can send me an email at 3 in the morning.
There you go. There you go. Won't open at 3 in the morning.
Absolutely not, no.
David, just one quick question before we move on. How do we know what's in scope and what's out of scope?
So it's the geography. That's
Okay,
what's in
that's
scope.
what-
We're looking
okay.
at these zoning districts as they are. And
Okay.
then, what's in those things? What are the standards that are in those zoning districts? How are they applied?
Thank you. That's
We're
helpful.
not going to talk about subdivision regulations per se, but there are some of the standards that are applicable in a subdivision review process. So we'll kind of navigate our way through that. So the last slide.
Yeah, if things come up and they're not clear, we can just
Yeah.
hash it out, talk about it.
Thank you.
So this is our scope, the scope and the timeline. So it identifies a number of different tasks down the left-hand side. And the expectation is that we'll have this work done by the beginning of December. Which would mean we've gone through the process of reviewing the ordinance, undertaking an audit and making some recommendations that Linda and I have already started working on that we'll present to you for discussion. Some community engagement, some things that you as a commission might want to do, but also some specific stakeholder conversations that I'm going to want to do with different folks that I know have already raised concerns or questions about the zoning or have ideas of things that we ought to consider. We'll bring that all together into a specific set of recommendations for you to talk about and ultimately to decide where you want to go into a formal amendment, proposed amendment to the zoning regulations that end up on the desk of the select board for their approval.
So is there, a timeline from the grant side of things that is be an issue potentially or not?
Mhm.
No, we'll be well within the grant period.
The grant goes for 2 years and
Oh,
our goal is to have this done in 1.
Beautiful.
So,
And there's a financial incentive for towns to get the work done on
Yes.
time.
Yep.
Okay, any questions about the project itself? Okay. So let's, as soon as Linda's ready, we can go to zoning 101.
okay, let me get the other one.
I know that many of you are immersed in or have been immersed in the zoning in one way or another, but I'm going to assume that you don't have a great familiarity of the ordinance, that there are folks participating on the Zoom or who might look at this video link later who have no understanding about zoning. So this is really a 101 conversation. Point 10 feet. You can go right to the next slide.
Okay.
So zoning is, for some people, is a dirty word. I remember when I was little, my mother was on our local planning commission. I had no idea what that meant, but I knew from dining room conversations that the word zoning really struck a chord in some people. Because it's a pretty powerful tool that we use to regulate land use and development. Then the next slide. And some important things to kind of understand around what zoning is and what it's intended to do. Because there can be a lot of confusion. It is a local permitting process. It is not Act 250. Act 250 is something completely different. There are relationships, if you will, but they are completely different processes using completely different regulatory standards. It is focused specifically on land use and development, how land is used and converted to other uses and other purposes. And very importantly, it is intended to implement the town's plan. You can't have zoning by itself. Zoning is a tool that you implement what your vision was. So you just spent a good deal of time and effort talking about what's the vision, you know, how do we want our community to develop over time? Zoning is a principal tool, not the only one, but a principal tool used to help you get where you want to go. So it looks at what goes where, what kinds of things, kinds of land uses, kinds of buildings, kinds of development can happen where in a community. Typically, your community is divided into different geographic areas that have different purposes, different intents, and the zoning regulations describe what happens there. It typically includes how big and how much. How big can the buildings be? How big can the uses be? How much development can occupy, you know, an acre of land or a square foot of land. It also includes mechanisms to protect special features. Typically, they are natural resource features, they're cultural features, but they can also be things that are unique to a community one way or another. And the final point is that zoning permits run with the land. If Susan gets a zoning permit to turn her house into a hair salon, then when she sells that house, that permit goes on to the next person. It's not something that Susan can take with her when she moves to another property in Jericho or outside of Jericho. That zoning permit, the permit to allow you to do what you've done in terms of building something, but more importantly, to undertake a particular type of use, stays on that property. Okay, next slide. So why do we have zoning? Ultimately, the purpose behind zoning is to protect the public health, safety, and welfare. Yeah, it is part of the police powers of government to be able to regulate land use and development. Going back well back in time to British common law, but in the United States back to the turn of the previous century when zoning became more formalized. It really is about supporting a planned pattern of development, not just letting any kind of development of any shape and size happen anywhere in your community. It is critical to helping to guide both the public and private investment. And those two things happen hand in hand. And it is that public investment, the creation of roads and sewers and sidewalks in schools that help create places that you want to concentrate private development around. It helps to stabilize our property values because you know what can happen in your neighborhood in terms of the size and scale and type of development. And that's very important tool for protecting the community's character. And again, those natural resources, those cultural resources of a community. Next slide. There are lots of different types of zoning. They don't come in one flavor. The different types serve different purposes. There is what is traditionally known as Euclidean zoning, simply meaning it's regulating uses based on geographic areas. But there's also performance-based zoning, where something can happen if these certain performance criteria are satisfied, either positively or negatively. The development doesn't have an undue adverse impact on noise or dust or traffic, or it achieves certain performance-based objectives. There's form-based zoning, which is more focused on the physical form that new development takes. Most zoning ordinances are some sort of a hybrid. They include one or more of these different types. And Jericho zoning is a good example of that. You have Euclidean, traditional Euclidean standards in the zoning. There are some performance criteria, and you have really a standalone form-based code for part of Riverside. Next slide. Oops, I don't know what that's like.
I was wondering what that was. Looks like you're tearing the map out of a book or something.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh,
Is this the one you thought was next?
no, but we'll go with it.
Okay.
We'll go with it. So, as I just said, in your development regulations, you really have two ordinances in one. The character-based zoning is really a standalone zoning regulation. It's not an overlay because everything that happens, an overlay influences what happens to the zoning underneath it in certain ways. The character-based zoning erases most of everything that's in the zoning districts that might otherwise apply in Riverside and imposes its own standards. So you really have two separate ordinances here that are tied together, because while there are district standards and development standards within the character-based zoning, it also refers back to the other part of the ordinance for other kinds of standards like parking requirements and subdivision process and things like that. So they're related and they refer to one another, but the character-based zoning really stands on its own. Stepping back a little bit, within Jericho zoning, there are 7 base zoning districts, and there are 4 different overlay districts. So again, that overlay district meaning this area is zoned for agriculture and rural residential development, but overlaid on top of that are places that are subject to special flood hazard or are wetlands, and development is further restricted because of the presence of those natural features, and either can't occur or has to occur in a different way. An example being flood hazard regulations. There are places within the flood hazard zoning that you cannot have new development. There are other places where you can, but if you do, you have to meet certain flood hazard area requirements. There's, of course, entire permit and review procedure process, the administration and enforcement process that's described in the zoning ordinance, and most zoning ordinances, all zoning ordinances, have a comprehensive set of definitions for key terms that are included in. All right, next slide.
Is this what you were expecting?
Sure, that one works. So, now I'm gonna focus a little bit more on specifically form-based codes, and particularly then the character-based zoning, because I think this is something that people get easily confused about. It can be a little complicated when you're literally turning the process on its head. Traditional Euclidean zoning, first and foremost, is focused on use. These kinds of uses can happen here, but they can't happen here. That's where it starts. And then there are other kinds of standards that are built on top of that. The size of the lot, the site design considerations, and maybe some building design considerations. A lot of traditional zoning doesn't really say anything about the building. Form-based zoning puts use at the end. It focuses on the physical form that the development how that development manifests itself on the ground. That's what's most important, because different development looks different, feels different, depending on what its purpose is, and depending on what your objectives are for the place that zoning is being applied to. So it looks at things like, how big is the block? Why is that important? Because about walking distance, typically form-based zoning is most commonly applied in a mixed-use area rather than in a rural residential area. It can be, but again, most commonly it's in that village center or that downtown center. And block length is really important in how far people have to walk to get from one intersection to the next. The size and width of a lot. Well, traditional zoning is concerned about how big a lot can be. Can you have a 1 acre lot? Can you have a 5 acre lot? Can you have a 10 acre lot? Form-based zoning may be concerned about the size of the lot, but it's more concerned with how wide is the lot. Because as you know, when you look around a place like Jericho, that there's some lots that are really deep and there's some lots that are really shallow. And, it's just a result of the size of the land that you had to work with, that maybe the back of that lot bumps up against some sort of a natural feature, and ownership changes as a result of that, or you have an oddly shaped block and you have some lots in the corners that are really small and other lots in the middle that are really deep. But how wide that lot is defines how, when somebody's walking down the street, what is the frequency of their experience in changing from building to building to building to building. Where on the lot is the building located? Again, site design features are really important. The physical form of the frontage, which is that front property line, and then the use. Because by the time you handle all of the other aspects of looking at the physical form, often use becomes secondary, because the physical form will define, or in many cases exclude, a lot of the uses that you probably don't want there anyway, right? If your building size, location, form, lot size and width, frontage form, all of those things are focused on narrow lots, narrow buildings, residential character. There's no way that a rendering plant is going to be able to fit inside a building of that size. They just don't work that way, or a gas station for that matter. Or in some cases, in a more of an urban setting, why not? If you can fit your gas station into the physical form that we prescribed in the zoning code, great, go nuts, because you're satisfying all of our other objectives. We don't really care what that use is going to be. All right, next. Wow, yours?
Is that not
PDF.
what you
didn't-
expected?
No, the PDF didn't really like. Um. huh. Well, it doesn't really matter, because the point here simply is, it's a quote from, H. Thomas Johnson. Perhaps what you measure is what you get, and what you don't or can't measure is lost. Form-based code is all about measuring what you have as a starting point, and then using that as a mechanism or a yardstick for understanding what do you want more of. So if we start with the premise that we like the physical character of buildings and lots in a place, then we need to make sure that the regulations allow it to perpetuate itself. Traditional zoning typically does not let that happen. That it has imposed development standards of from another place, and they don't work. So what often happens is that you have the development that exists there on the ground today is all non-conforming, means it doesn't apply, it doesn't conform to the requirements of the ordinance, and is therefore, the ordinance is saying it should go away. If that's not your goal, then you need to make sure that the zoning regulations fit what's actually there that allows that to perpetuate itself and create more of it. All right, next slide. So I touched on this a little bit before. Form-based codes are most applicable, most widely used in some sort of a mixed use center. And it's focused largely on what's referred to as the public realm. The public realm is the space between the buildings across the street. So from building face to building face, you have a public realm and you have a private realm. So the private realm would be from the building face to the edge of the property. That's private property. What happens there is different. And what happens within the public right of way then is the public realm. But that entire space is what we experience as human beings when we walk down that street, we ride our bike, we drive our car. That's what the form-based code is primarily focused on, because it's about creating that human experience. What happens outside of that space is important, but it's of less interest. So where on the lot is the building and the parking located? Typically, you want the building to be closer to the street and the parking farther from the street. How high is the building? What's the sense of the massing of that building? How does the building engage with the street? Does that building invite people into it or turn them away? Is it obvious how I get into that building? Again, am I being invited in? If it's a mixed use place, you should be inviting people into your building if you want to sell your product. It's not just about, oh, I know this is a really good place, even though it's a dive. You know, the space ought to be inviting people in. And that's has to do with the location and frequency of entrances, the amount and the transparency of the glass. Again, can I see inside? Can I understand what's going on inside this building and want to go in and be part of that? So you see the contrasting examples on the photographs below. Is the street on the left a street that you would want to walk down? That you would find that to be interesting, is exciting, versus the other one? I did a workshop in Burlington where we took people, participants, and walked down some of the streets, the side streets off of Church Street, and asked these very questions. What do you think about this? When you walk down Cherry Street, how does that make you feel? Versus walking down Church Street. When you walk down, Bank Street or College Street, how does that make you feel? What are the things that are different in one place versus another that make you feel more or less like this is a place that I want to be? Next slide. And this is because traditionally in Euclidean zoning, commercial is and a land use map is typically identified in a color of red, some version of red, or some variations of red, different kinds of commercial uses. And typically on a zoning map, both of these images would show up as being red. They're both commercial. They both might be mixed use, but they're two entirely different experiences. And they're both serve entirely different functions. Is that what you want? The one on the left, or would you rather have the one on the right? The one on the left, again, it serves certain purposes, but not nearly as well as the one on the right from a pure economics standpoint. Next slide. So what happens where on a street is critically important to how it makes us feel. So both images are the same place. The lower image has been digitally enhanced to add street trees, to add street lights, bike lanes, center median, those things within the public realm that make that, bring that space together, make it more inviting, more interesting place for people to be. Next slide. And in your character-based zoning, you describe some of these things. This image, very common image you see in a form-based code anywhere. This actually comes out of yours, but describing the differences between the private frontage and the public frontage, because you have thoroughfare standards in the zone, which are basically, they are physical street design standards. Next slide. So I've touched on many of these points here. The standards in Jericho's form-based code are really trying to look at what exists there today. And as part of the analysis of creating the character-based zoning, the consultant did an assessment, did an inventory of properties where they actually went out and measured the setbacks of properties and yards, looked at the width of lots, looked at the predominant pattern of buildings, and put that information into the code. A form-based code can serve a couple of different functions in these kinds of places. One is to perpetuate what exists, and one is to create something new. So in a place like Jericho, you're largely trying to perpetuate what exists while allowing for some variation in areas where there's new opportunities, particularly in a place like Riverside, where you've got some vacant space where you could do something new. So then the question is, do you want it to be all residential building types, like it is in the rest of the district, or do you want some other things to happen there? Next slide. So some important concepts around that are found in form-based codes. The first is the term regulating plan. Regulating plan is really just a song. Don't let the real form-based geeks tell you otherwise, but it's the physical manifestation of what are the zones, how are they defined geographically, and then it'll talk more about what happens within them. So within the regulating plan for Riverside, you have CD4, character district 4, which is the dark color, and CD3, which is the lighter color. You also have a civic zone. Civic zones are typically public spaces. And there's one shown on the map, the corner of Dickinson Street. Next slide. Most zoning ordinances talk about buildings. When they say buildings, they mean kind of any physical thing. Form-based codes, your form-based code, is very specific about buildings versus structures. The difference typically is structures are non-habitable spaces, not places that are used to store things, or enclosures for people, property, or animals. It's really important distinction because there are structures that you're going to treat structures differently than buildings. I'm sorry that the formatting got all.
Yeah, that was a little weird.
I should have double checked on that. I made the next slide. Frontages and facades. And again, these terms are very precisely used because you use them with real purpose in form-based code. So a
And David,
frontage,
if I could just,
yeah, good.
this is directly from the Jericho zoning too, correct?
This is in, yes,
Images.
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah, it is. So a frontage is a property line that runs along a street, a public street, a public thoroughfare. You might have two frontages. You may have a primary frontage and a secondary frontage, simply meaning that one is where the front of the building is and the other is the side, but you've got a corner lot. So you have two streets, you have two frontages, and pretty sure Jericho's, you decide which is your primary frontage, which is your secondary frontage. But you have to have both. You have to have both of them. You can't have two primary frontages and you can't have two secondary frontages. But frontage is always referred to as is that front property line. A facade, and this is where Chris may chafe at facades versus elevations.
It's the only place I can chafe or.
No, not at all. There'll be plenty of things. We'll get to some of that stuff for sure. A facade is always the face of the building facing the primary frontage. Every other side of a building is an elevation, a side elevation, a rear elevation. The facade is always that. So when you read in a form-based code about a facade of a building, you always know that's the front, or that is what must be the front, and it must be on a primary frontage.
And it just refers to its appearance.
Excuse me?
And it refers to its, a facade refers to its appearance, the appearance of the front or other.
It begins with referring to its location. So a facade is always about its location, and then there are other standards that say on a facade is where you must put a primary entrance. Because that's when you're walking down the street, that's how you access that building. You may access it in other places too, but you must have a primary entrance on a facade. The next group are lot layers. Doesn't treat the entire lot as one big thing. You have a first layer, you have a second layer, and you have a third layer. And you may have two of each if it's a corner lot. But for simplicity's sake, the first lot layer is the space in front of the building from the frontage line, the front property line, to the facade of the building. That front space, whether it's required or not, is your first lot layer.
Always on the primary.
It's always on the primary. Or it's on a primary or a secondary. It's always on the frontage. So if you've got a 10-foot front yard setback, your first lot layer is 10 feet. So from the facade of the building to the primary or secondary frontage line. The second lot layer is always 20 feet behind the facade of the building. Regardless of where the facade of the building is located, if it's set back 10 feet or if it's right on the property line, the second lot layer is 20 feet behind the facade.
Regardless of how big the building is.
Regardless of how big the building.
That's exclusive to the CBD that we have right now,
That's exclusive to the form-based code, right?
that we have in Jericho.
Yeah. The third lot layer is then everything beyond that, all the way to the rear property. But again, Form-based codes, yours in particular, is very precise about how it uses these terms. Form-based codes have a lot of flexibility in them, but for all of that flexibility, they are very prescriptive. And the intent behind them being very prescriptive is that it's very objective. You know what you can do and what you must do in order to get a permit. There's not a question about it. Therefore, if you've done X, Y, and Z like the code lays out, you should be able to get a permit. No questions asked. That's the magic sauce behind form-based codes in general. All right, next slide. I remember the first time I saw this. Yard types. I never really thought of it before. But once I saw this, it was like, oh, that's genius. So a yard type, an edge yard, okay, how buildings typically are laid out. The building sits not right in the middle, but somewhere in the middle of the lot. There's a front yard setback, there's 2 side yard setbacks in the building. That's pretty common. I'll jump to the bottom one, rear yard. In a mixed-use commercial district, the building's right on the front property line, you've got space in the back. Okay, we all understand that. But the side yard. The building sits on a side property line. It may be right at the frontage line or not, but it sits on a side property line. Typically, your zoning regulations wouldn't allow this to happen. A lot of them wouldn't, because most of them say you must have 5 feet or 10 feet in both side yards. But there's a lot of development in Vermont, in Jericho, in Burlington that are side yards. And it's like,
Barry's a great side yard town.
yeah, they're everywhere. But the zoning doesn't allow that to continue to happen. This does, because it recognizes that in certain situations that you can have this kind of a yard configuration. But it all comes down to, it's very important where you place the building on the lot is very important to how then that street, that public realm feels and is misunderstood. All right, next slide. I tend to think of form-based code, and I'll say this interchangeably just because the consultant that did Jericho's form-based code is the same consultant that started to do Burlington's code. And we then took it much farther than they did, but it's basically laid out in the same way. And I think of it as these are Lego pieces that in your code, you have a form district or a character district where things can happen. Within those, each character district, it will say what kinds of buildings, what are the building types that are allowed in this district. It may include a frontage type, or a building type may require certain frontage types, which is how the facade of the building manifests itself. Is it residential in nature that has a porch? Is it commercial in nature and has retail and lots of glass? What does that mean? How do you kind of physically define the characteristics of those types of frontages? But you take all of these pieces and you plug them together in order to create a development within a form-based code. Next slide. So as an example, you have your yard type, which defines the relationship of the building to the lot, where the building gets placed. And then knowing that and knowing what types of building types are permitted on a lot, is it a single family? Is it a duplex? Is it a multifamily? Is it a mixed use? Is it cottage court?
But you're saying not use. Like building type, so you're just listing examples of building
Right,
types.
these are types of buildings.
However, those are in those are uses in our table of uses.
Yeah. Yep, exactly. But it may be a single unit building, it may be a dual unit building or a duplex. Doesn't necessarily mean that they have to be residential. It's
Okay,
just the physical manifestation of this is that you have a building that has one thing in it.
Yeah.
You have another building that has two things in
Okay.
it, and they may be side by side, they may be one on top of the other, maybe one front to back.
yeah,
It's agnostic to the use,
okay,
typically, the building types are.
So in that structure, you could end up with a butcher shop next door to a kindergarten
You
and
could,
in-home daycare.
and then the frontage type is the relationship of the building to the street. How does the facade of that building, the front of that building, interact with the street and the people that are on it? Because remember, that's the key thing that you're trying to achieve, particularly in a village or mixed-use district, is a place that people want to be. Is a place where people want to come out and interact, where they want to shop, where they want to live, where they want to do all these things. So you want to create a place that is comfortable and inviting for people. All right, next slide. Here's where the architect starts. Maybe don't start to shake, but the rash becomes
Getting heavy here.
really heavy. Not all form-based codes, but many of them have architectural or urban design standards in them. And often they're most heavily applied to a facade of a building, but not always. Again, they're primarily interested in the experience of the passerby on the street and how people interact with them. These are just some examples of different types of design standards. Facade voids and distances is a pretty common one, that there are windows of a certain size or proportion on a facade or an elevation of the building, and they're no farther apart than a certain distance, so that you're not creating large blank walls. And glazing, transparency, and reflectance, again, being able to see inside. This is something that's really important for commercial uses, restaurants, retail spaces. Why a retail space puts up mirrored glass, I don't understand.
CVS.
You know, you should be able to see what's going on inside, be invited to come inside. Are there patrons inside that are shopping? Is there, is there a robbery going on inside? There's all kinds of values to be able to see inside and see outside. Remember, as humans, we are social creatures. We love to watch other people do whatever it is they're doing, whether we're walking down the street, peering inside at somebody in a restaurant, or vice versa. We got the window seat, so we're watching all these people walk by. You got to be able to see outside, see through that glass.
You feel so dependent on use. I don't want to get down a tangent,
Yeah.
but like if it's a doctor's office, or places in where you might not want to be seen, but yet that service still has value to the community. So that is it's a contradiction to me.
So it's gonna depend on the type of frontage requirements. So if it's what is referred to, I believe in your ordinance as well, a shop front, then those kind of transparency and reflectance requirements are gonna be pretty important, pretty high. There are other types of frontage types, like an office front, where that's less of an issue, where you could have more privacy, and particularly if it's a residential use, you want even a higher degree of privacy.
So what was the term that you used? Frontage?
So it's a frontage type.
Thank you.
Mhm.
That certainly wouldn't preclude, say, a beauty salon from having reflective windows if they wanted to preserve people's getting their hair colored, didn't want the rest of town to know that they had their hair.
Well, so again, it depends on, if you're looking to create, you're typically trying to create a space that has multiple purposes, because that shop, retail, that commercial space, it might be a salon to start with, but may turn over 10 times into 10 other uses, and you want to have that flexibility. So if it's in a shop front frontage, you're gonna have we typically have those transparency and reflectance requirements. There was a good example I had in Burlington where, there were 3 shop fronts along College Street that had transitioned in my tenure, probably, each of them 5 different times, from hair salon to coffee shop to, armed services recruiting station to, who knows what. But the ability of that space to be able to easily turn over as market demands necessitate is what's really important.
So if the use is less important, then why would a developer choose a frontage type that has higher requirements? Why wouldn't if that's the most expensive, if that doesn't dictate the use?
Because it may be because it's of what they're trying to achieve, that they're trying to create a commercial space.
Right.
And these are kind of all of the characteristics and factors that they would want to incorporate in building that type of space. There's one side of that equation. The other side of that equation is, do the regulations require it? You've got a main street or a core commercial district. It's pretty common for a form-based code to say a shop front is required along these block faces, not the side streets, but here you must do a shop front.
Mhm. Because you're trying to drive an economic center.
Right. Yeah.
And then if the uses change over time and the use will be better served by one frontage type or another, does the regulation require the building to be renovated to then incorporate that new frontage type?
So if you're requiring that frontage type, it wouldn't allow it to be changed. You would still have to meet that frontage type requirements. If it didn't,
Mhm.
then there might be two or 3 other frontage types to choose from that are part of the ordinance that you could convert it to.
Okay,
So namely, in that kind of context, that downtown mixed-use district, it might be a shop front or an office front. So
Mhm.
higher transparency standards, lesser transparency standards.
Mhm.
Excuse me, by example. Next slide.
Can I ask another question?
Yeah.
So where would things like, energy efficiency standards come in? Like there's standard building codes which are governed by the state.
Yeah.
Right? So if we were looking at higher energy efficiency, if we wanted to consider that, would that be under this category here?
Not necessarily. You've also got statewide energy code requirements.
Right.
So you could incorporate various thresholds for energy efficiency or building efficiency types within your zoning ordinance generally, or in certain districts. Buildings over a certain size must meet this type of requirement, but not typically this
Not here.
type of stuff.
Okay. Thank you.
Mhm. All right, next slide. So again, just some examples about street activation. So the slide, the 2 pictures on the left, that's what you're trying to avoid, even though somebody thought that was really cool in New York. I'm sure they did. I'm sure it was a really expensive building to build, but it does nothing for the street. It may be, it may in fact be a library, I think. But again, it does nothing for the street. And you're really trying to create buildings here that activate the street. So again, examples of what proportion of a facade must be in void, meaning doors and or windows, how far apart can they be? So that they're not all concentrated in one location and you again have these large blind spots. Next slide. How buildings articulate themselves, both horizontally and vertically. Some of these standards get pretty urban, but they're important concepts to understand, particularly where you might allow multiple buildings with 0 side yard setbacks to align against one another. It's really important that you have changes in the plane. So vertical changes in the horizontal plane, as shown here, and horizontal changes in the vertical plane. They create shadow lines amongst the different blocks of the building. Chafing, yeah, exactly. You don't want a large monolithic structure, particularly, I would argue, in a fine-grained New England community. You want to perpetuate some of that fine grain. You may allow for a large building, but if there are find ways that you can have greater granularity of the building, it creates greater visual interest for the passerby.
But the problem with this is, and you can see it all around Chittenden County.
Mhm.
You can see where they're using form-based code. You're trying to create a granularity that originally grew organically over time,
Exactly.
and you're trying to impose it instantaneously. And so you get what to me look like very fake, very arbitrary, not very visually appealing at all changes in materials just to meet the form-based code requirement, which would, in my opinion, are worse than just a clean logic to a new building of a certain size.
Yeah, I don't disagree, and particularly because you do see, in a lot of places, you see more development happening in a shorter period of time. So it's all happening at once, as opposed to it's more organic.
Yeah, it sort of looks like frontier town.
It looks like Walt Disney.
And it can't, particularly if it's a large development that is developed kind of under the same developer. You see these large residential developments where they have to change the building design, every 4th building or something like that, because you don't want them to all be the same. When you see those kind of large subdivisions, absolutely.
And there's an example of that on Route 15 coming into Winooski, where you've got one building that's got 4 different facades and one entrance. It's clearly an attempt to make it look like they all grew at different times. It was just,
Yeah.
it looks fake.
It's to break up the mass.
I think anybody can see through that. Maybe that's not something we would want to do, to say, instead of that, build them as separate buildings.
But to build them as separate buildings is
Costly.
very expensive.
Yeah.
And you've got, typically, in those cases, you have a single property with a single property owner.
Yeah.
They're trying to achieve an economy of scale by having common floor plates and other things. So you need to break down that mass.
It's also true that there are very beautiful and friendly large buildings.
Yeah.
That aren't
That look like
arbitrarily
a single
broken down
Yeah.
into these requirements.
And there are, I thought you were gonna say, there are a lot of buildings that completely disrupt any of these kinds of requirements that are just really cool. They're really interesting to look at,
Well, there's that.
even though they don't have, some of these kind of common elements. That's for sure. And there are form-based codes that allow for that, as well. But that becomes much more complicated, a much more subjective process.
But we, as part of this process, have the opportunity to revise
Yes.
all of this.
Yeah. And you don't necessarily have all of these things in your code. I'm just using these as examples of how different types of urban design standards work and what some of the more common ones are. All right, next slide. Next slide is just horizontal changes. So as the building gets taller, it's required to step back at some point in time. Again, to break up that sight line. Next slide.
You don't like the handout to it?
Blank one.
Yeah, there is supposed to be a blank one.
Okay, let me stop at the blank
All right.
one.
Yeah, no, you
Okay.
can go on to the next one. So again, we're gonna talk a little bit more specifically now about Jericho's code. Again, the character-based code is basically a standalone ordinance within your zoning regulations applying just to a portion of the Riverside district. Next slide. The two character districts, there's character district 4, which is a mixed use district. It allows for a greater variety of building types and range of uses than character district 3, which is mixed residential, which is primarily looking at residential building types and residential uses that are allowed with a smaller proportion of non-residential uses. Again, mostly manifested by the building type, but also the types of uses that
Quick question,
it permits.
in the CD4, correct me if I'm wrong, but most of that is currently undeveloped.
Yes,
And CD3 is pretty much already
yeah,
developed out.
yeah.
So does this envision a change in any existing structures in CD3, or is this all infill?
It would be infill. You know, where infill can happen, it's kind of defining how that can happen.
Okay.
You know, it's not suggesting that residential character needs to change, needs to be something different.
Mhm.
And it's more expressly trying to define and capture what are those physical characteristics of those buildings and how do we allow that to continue?
Are we discussing where those two districts are gone? Is that up for discussion or not?
So as part of this grant project, we're not talking about the boundaries of these districts. We're just
I don't
talking
mean
about,
the character-based district, I mean 3 versus 4.
right, yeah, we're not,
That's not,
we're not changing the boundaries of the district at this point. We can certainly put that on, again, on the parking lot for. Is that the only place that you would envision mixed uses in this area or not?
I just want to say, I think it's important to acknowledge that the form-based code premise of basing new construction on the character of what's existing is an interesting to apply to CD4, where it's largely vacant.
Mm-hmm.
And especially because I think what we should ideally have there is a fair amount of density that doesn't exist. So I
In
just,
Jericho,
in Jericho.
but we can find really close by, like Richmond.
Well, yes, but I just want us to be aware that as we go through this, that it's us, there's sort of a gap in the applying form-based code to that area because there's nothing there now.
Right.
What we're proposing is something entirely different than what's there now.
So is there an opportunity that you want to be sure is capitalized in a greater way?
Well, my hope, my personal hope is that there's a fair amount of density there.
Mhm.
And I know it's a distinct sense of place.
Chris,
Yeah.
can I ask something though before, I'm sorry.
Sure.
Did you say that there's a preference I'm sorry. Let's see if I can ask this question. But you were about to make another point. I thought, I can't wait for that other point because I had missed the first point. And so I apologize for interrupting, but I think your first point was that nothing exists there now, so having it be based on what exists now to carry forward doesn't make sense, like,
Well,
is that?
yes, there's a slight flaw in the logic of applying form-based code. The strict sense of form-based code is you're trying to create something that carries on from what's there now.
Right, and so does our current form-based code for this particular area say that it's assuming we're carrying something forward as opposed to creating something new? That's the part that I'm hearing you that's
Well, it's
usually how it
applying-
is.
It's applying I think it's applying a lot of forms from surrounding areas to this place that, in my opinion, could be different than a gable roof farmhouse.
So,
That might be
okay,
down the
so
road.
it is sort of already the way that we have it here in Jericho, sort of saying.
So like the bank
Mhm,
has the same roof line as the church, because that's what the code calls for.
because,
We
okay,
don't want a bunch of Union Bank buildings filling up the
Mhm,
dark blue
mhm.
space.
and that
but that's what the
happened
code
because
calls
the
for,
current code says.
Because the code is saying that we want to emulate the other buildings
Thank
in
you.
town, including where we are today, right here in
Mhm.
in the corners, and the Jericho Center. And I think what Chris has talked about before, and what I envision, is more like downtown Richmond,
Okay.
right?
Okay.
We don't have that in Jericho.
Mhm,
So the current form-based code is really myopic.
Thank you.
Yes, we don't want to have this huge departure that feels really unnatural. But it may look like something that we don't currently have in Jericho and still feel really fitting.
So the way that whoever chose to write it previously wrote it in a way that says it should conform to existing character as opposed to allow something different. And your question then is, can we undo that?
Can we reimagine?
Are we,
Yeah.
are we allowed?
Yes.
Yes, and
It-
yes.
It
Yes.
is something that
And
we
we
can
are allowed,
change.
that's the whole point of this
Thank
conversation.
you. I just need to make sure I was
Yeah.
super
It's both-
grounded.
It's both shape and density.
Yes,
Uh-huh.
yeah.
Okay, thank you. Sorry to interrupt the flow. I just
No.
really thought
No,
like,
it's
oh, I'm
really-
missing something
No,
really
it's
important
really
here.
important. It's
Okay.
really important.
The current, and we'll get into this a lot more later, but, you know, the standards assume that the development pattern outside of the dark purple area, that development pattern would continue into the dark area where there's
Which is exactly what I
literally nothing
don't.
now, which,
Right.
you know,
Thank
okay,
you.
that's one option, but particularly given the fact that it's a big vacant lot, you could do all kinds of
And
stuff
it's a
there.
flat vacant lot. So
And it's a
like you
flat-
talked about before, the constraints, there are very few environmental constraints in that space saying that you can't build more
Yeah.
dense.
Okay.
And to your point, Sarah, specifically, flat roofs are not allowed.
Correct.
In their
So
current
if you go
form-based
to-
code.
If you go to Richmond, if you
Yeah.
go to Bristol.
Go to
downtown
Jeffersonville.
Bristol,
Yeah.
Jeffersonville.
Yeah, St. Albans.
Westfield, St.
Yeah.
Albans, there's some beautiful Vermont downtowns that are very natural
Thank you.
Yeah.
and feel
Mhm.
fitting and maintain the character without being as restrictive as the current form-based code.
Thank you.
Right.
I think
Thank you.
at the same time, we don't want to turn it into something that looks like Shepherd's Corners necessarily.
Correct,
Right.
So
yeah,
that's where the form-based code is coming back to say,
yes,
in keeping with what might be a traditional New England village center, a la Richmond, Bristol, Jeffersonville, Morrisville, but not in keeping with Finley Crossing or
Yeah.
many of those other
Yeah.
places that look quite different.
Right.
And right now, it's, as it's currently structured, it's almost a romantic version of Finley Crossing, where everybody has a gable roof and a
yeah,
front porch and a swing in the front set on a tree, or something like that.
Mayberry,
Yep.
But I do worry also about CD3, where we're putting in place a district in an area that at this point really doesn't seem to be showing any signs of changing property lines or development in there. And I wonder if we are just a little too far ahead of ourselves with that. Because we've got all of CD4 to develop. And then in order for CD3 to come along to what it looks like, which it does not look like right now. Lot lines have to change, properties have to be sold, there's a,
Not necessarily. I mean, could be, but I mean, you could redevelop an existing lot. You want to make sure that the types of development that you're enabling through your code fits with what's there, so you're not creating nonconformity where it shouldn't exist. Because if you're a nonconforming building or non-conforming use, it's a pain in the neck. It's an unnecessary pain in the neck for the property owner. When they're already doing something and have something that you like and you want them to be able to continue to do it, but if they want to add on a porch, it's harder to do than it should be. So you want to allow that to happen, but you also want to allow for some evolution to happen. That
Yeah.
it may be a residential
And I think
building, but
people, when they consider the value of their property on the current lot in the light blue spaces that are adjacent to the dark blue space, they're not today thinking, I want to build an ADU or a something else right up to the edge of this lot line, up to the edge of the dark blue space, because it's empty. When the dark blue space is filled in 10 years or however long it takes, and they don't live next to a big empty space with tumbleweeds rolling across it, then it will feel natural for them to do more infill. So at that point, they may decide that there's a change in property ownership because those people may not want to live next to whatever is there. Or they may realize that their property value actually went up now that that dark blue area is filled in. And there's more potential value in their property than there once was, especially if there's municipal wastewater. And then it becomes a high value property where it was not before. So the idea is if we change the light blue space now, we want to change it now so that as soon as those next things become available, they can tap into them and it will make sense to build right up to the edge of the lot, adjacent to what's currently empty space.
That would argue that for the CD3 space, the light blue,
Yeah.
we should actually adopt a more liberal set of features, because what
Yes.
goes into CD4
Yes,
may interpret the idea, if I no longer really want something to look like the Victorian dollhouse, I want it to look like James Bond villain movie place. Concrete walls and fancy things in it. I'm being extreme.
Yeah.
But
yeah,
the point I'm making is we're restricting in an area that doesn't have much right now,
right.
and we have no idea what's gonna happen 10 years from now. So perhaps we should err on the side of being more liberal,
I
or more
agree.
restrictive.
I think we should be much more liberal in that CD3 space. That's what you're gonna hear me advocate for.
Yeah.
Is like, you're disrupting. We heard from a lot of people that are adjacent landowners that it will be disruptive to them. And that they've lived there for however many generations and had that space. And I think it's a natural evolution. But yes, it will feel disruptive, but there's huge potential for them to realize a great windfall from that evolution. Are we allowed to take questions from the crowd?
Are you allowed? That's, I guess, that's what I.
It's up to you, really.
You're the chair.
Sure. Yeah, you have to come to the microphone.
And identify yourself, please.
I have some stuff. I'll wait till you're done, Dave. My question, I guess, in regards to variables.
Who are you?
I'm Joe Flynn, and I'm speaking as a resident and consultant that does development quite a bit for developers. I have some reservations of adding any kind of variables in a form-based code. One of the positive things that I like about form-based code, and our clients would definitely prefer, is it's regimented. This is the course. This is how we get from here to here. And if we meet those requirements, we limit our meetings, we limit our hearings, we limit our appeals. Now, every time you offer a variable, we have a possibility for another meeting, another appeal. So I like the form-based code, and I think overall a lot of developers like it because we know the path now. We know exactly what's expected. And if we meet that, we get from point A to point B very quickly, and that is a goal. Okay, so I understand meeting people's or making people comfortable because it is right next to them. But again, we have a form-based code, and we still end up going through quite a few hearings. You know, take Joseph, classic example, to get to the final point. If anything, from our aspect, we like the more regimented. How can we make this more distinct so staff gets us there?
More black and white.
Exactly, exactly.
I think it can be black and white. I just think the current code is,
Currently,
Too much black and not enough white.
Yeah.
yes.
Or, there's it's not so much. Right, it's like, this is allowed, which right now is a very big list,
Mhm.
and it sounds like what we're saying is we want what's allowed to potentially be a larger list.
correct.
A less restrictive.
A less
Yes,
restrictive.
so that
list
it's,
allows for more density and
And more
Well, we
variable.
haven't talked about-
less peaked roofs.
we haven't talked about density at all yet.
When you're done, I want to talk about that. I got some
Yeah,
ideas,
we've
but I want to
only-
let you done, so I'm getting that.
We've only talked about dimensional standards.
Right.
Um,
But the existing.
because
floor-
my understanding is that it doesn't regulate density.
It can,
But roof shape and height can regulate
Exactly,
density
right.
because that's math.
Right, so dimensions, unlike the other parts of Jericho zoning, which do regulate density.
if I say how wide the lot can be,
Mhm,
or how wide a building can be,
Right.
and how tall the building can be,
mhm. Right,
you're getting there.
if it
Because math.
quacks like a duck, then it is a duck, or whatever that expression is.
What
Yeah,
is,
Fan-
what does density mean?
Right.
anyway?
Right, but just to remind ourselves where we are, this zoning already exists. It was already adopted and it's been in place for 10 years or something. At least.
Yeah, I think.
12 years,
I
is
think.
it 2012?
So we're looking
2014,
at,
I think.
amending it and improving it.
Yeah.
Not necessarily creating something new or
Right.
throwing this
Right.
away or anything.
And I think in the best way, we can say that we have proof that the current zoning has not facilitated growth or development. If it's been in place that long and it's still mostly,
Yeah, my point on it is we're very descriptive and restrictive in what we can do based on the current regulations and the square footage of windows and percentage of facade and and recognizing I'm not a developer, I get it, I don't do that, but we're gonna end up with an awful lot of cookie cutter looks at that way, and I think the town of Jericho would prefer more individuality in the buildings that go in. So more flexibility of, yes, you need to have road frontage, yes, you need to have a certain amount of glass in the front, but does that have to be one great big window? Can you have 5 windows? Right now, we're saying each window has to be no more than 2 feet apart, like, really? We don't need that. Let an architect who knows what they're doing, spec that out.
if we could just have Chris do the whole thing, that'd be great.
All right, Linda, we can go to the next.
So
Okay,
is it, we're revisiting it now? Is it in part because the goals have changed? I mean, I imagine if it was created, if the form-based code or character-based code was developed 10 or 12 years ago, there was a certain level of motivation behind it, and has our motivation changed? I mean, I know we've talked a lot about the town plan changing the motivation to encourage growth in new ways, that is something that we worked really hard on. Is there some kind of underlying motivation that was in place when it was created that we should just articulate and say, this was the motivation and here's what played out, and therefore this is our new motivation, and therefore these are the parts of it that we want to change? For me, that's just really helpful to get my head ahead.
I think the motivation was the same, wasn't it?
I was gonna ask you all, my understanding is the motivation's really not that different.
No.
What you're finding though is it's not realized itself.
Okay, so it's
Is
same
that
motive.
what was created did not
Mhm.
allow for and
For whatever reason,
and facilitate
Yeah,
actual development happening.
I think the
And-
outcome, the desired outcome was similar, like a dense, active village
Right.
center, mixed use that everybody would love. But I think that I think the mechanism was perceived, this is total conjecture on my part, as one of, we'll get there through control. If we control it, then we're more likely to have a better outcome.
Okay,
And I think now we want a similar outcome, but I think through experience, there's a lot more experience in the area with form-based code. We have a different planning commission now. The planning commission was not at all in charge of this project. It was done completely outside the planning commission, so it wasn't really integrated into the process. So I think now the outcome we want is similar, but our technique is more of facilitation and encouragement and simplification and acceleration. So we want the same thing, but before it's like parenting. You know, it's like control, authoritarian, or benign neglect. Like, you know what the rules are. I'm not gonna watch you. You're gonna be home at 10 PM and that's just the way it's gonna be. I would say that would be my explanation.
My understanding too was that the way we ended up at this version of form-based code was a reaction to a lot of fear in the community.
yeah,
Because 10 years ago, what was being built was what is currently in Essex, on Essex Way right now, and Williston, right? All of that was being built really quickly with the flat roofs and the really boring facades, and
Yeah.
that there was a lot of outcries, like, we don't want to look like that.
great.
So
Thank you. That
it
is
was
just
really
so helpful to me as like going into the, thinking about the kinds of changes, sort of the. And I know you mentioned, David, about part of what we're gonna do is an audit, like it's one of the first things,
And
but
Rachel, I think, has given us a lot of great feedback.
yeah.
Over
So,
the years.
so that just understanding how the context has changed is super helpful. And therefore knowing like the pieces that were driven by emotion or fear or whatever, and a controlling way of moving things versus how we want to do it now. So thank you for helping me do that.
The planning commission, when this was coming out, was quite different. This was the planning commission that banned drive-throughs.
Yeah.
In Jericho, and their intention really was to maintain the look and feel of Jericho as a storybook New England town,
Yeah.
which led to what we have. It was, intention was to have growth there. I don't believe they quite saw it as restrictive, as more as just, this is the kind of growth we want, very direct.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
I think we're more open-minded.
Yeah, sorry to
That's okay. All right,
diverge.
so let's stop our discussion, let you
Yeah,
finish,
okay.
and then
Thank
we'll
you.
see how much time we have more for discussion.
So I refer to this as a Lego kit, a bunch of Lego parts. These are kind of what the parts are. We talked about the character zones. You've also got civic zones. Typically, you know, you've got a large site and, you know, you want to include some green space. These are the types of kind of public green spaces. They come in, typically, these are different sizes and intensities or the diversity of space. You know, from a park to a greenway to a green, typically a square is a small green. You know, a pocket park is a small square, you know, they're based on size often. You have building types. These are the building types that are defined in your code. Your code doesn't say much about the types themselves, just a description of what a house is versus what a duplex is versus what a row house is. You can include, it's not uncommon to include specific standards around various building types. Example being a row house, how wide a row house is. You know, these are row houses or townhouses, side-by-side buildings sharing a party wall. How wide can they be? How many in a row can you have? That type of thing.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but doesn't the current restrictions or current plan include presence of a porch, covered, uncovered versus?
So that,
and all of those.
that's a segue into a frontage type. You have a common yard, you have porches, you have stoops, forecourt, office front, shop front. These are again, different manifestation of what kind of happens in the front, on the front of the building, in the front of the building. These get a little these are not always just the building itself, you know, a shop front is the building itself, but of course, a common yard is the space in front of the building and how that space is treated. A forecourt is again, a combination of open space, physical space in the building and how they relate to one another. So you can have combinations of that. And your code also includes thoroughfare types. Different types of streets, different widths, different configurations, again, depending on different purposes. Within each character zone, it will describe which of these other things can happen there. And then it's up to an individual property owner, developer to say, I want to do a pocket park. I want to have these building types with these frontage types on them, and I'm going to serve them through these different types of thoroughfares, you know, if you've got enough space to actually create streets. They're picking from the menu, plugging them together, and creating their development plan. Next slide. You do have architectural design standards addressing these particular characteristics of the building. We'll talk a lot more about this.
We could just eliminate this altogether, save ourselves a lot of time.
I think there is a lot in here that needs to be pared down. Absolutely, not all of it, but there are definitely some things that will be part of my recommendations, but next slide. And lastly, the process. So Joe's left, but this is really where the rubber meets the road here. And as Joe articulated, most developers like red lights and the green lights. Tell me what I can do, tell me what I can't do. It's the yellow lights that drive people
Right.
crazy.
It's not reading the red lights that drive you crazy.
It's not the red lights.
Right.
And I've heard this time and time again
Mhm,
throughout my career is that it's not the red lights.
mhm.
You know, if you want pitched roofs on every building, metal pitched roofs, fine, tell me what the pitch is. But don't make me have to go to, you know, 3 public meetings in order to discuss, well, you know, is that too steep? I'm not so sure. It doesn't really relate to the one next to it, you know. That's what drives people crazy. That's what costs tremendous amount of money. That's what keeps a lot of property owners and developers on the sidelines. And I think that, as much as anything, is one of the biggest issues here with this code. And perhaps what hasn't happened in Riverside. So you have the standards is one thing, but the development review process is another. And this is within your form-based code, you have both things that the administrative officer can make decisions on and things that must go to a development review board. I've put a star next to site plan and simply noted here that there are certain things that are exempt from site plan review, but there's a lot of things that wouldn't be, particularly that you're trying to create. So your form-based code requires, in addition to these form standards, that requires a site plan review process. Subdivision.
Right,
review
my
process,
understanding of
number
like a lot of the delays or a lot of the time that it's taken for that property to get through review is more related to subdivision and site plan. The CBZ standards have mostly applied around frontage and thoroughfares because it's a blank space. There's been no delay based on buildings and roof pitches and architectural standards or anything. It's been all site layout, which is the overlap of the traditional zoning standards and the character-based zoning standards.
Right.
That's been the complicated.
Yep.
fact.
And the fact that there are these 2 things
Mhm,
going on as
Mhm.
opposed to 1.
right.
These are the site standards. Check the boxes and move on.
So are you saying, just to make sure that I'm understanding, that we could, in our revisiting, consider taking out the requirement of a site plan that bumps it over to the development review board?
Yes,
We could do that.
Yeah.
We could consider.
you can incorporate the site plan standards someplace else
Mhm,
and have all of that reviewed.
mhm. Because what you're
Administrative.
saying is if it all could be in that left column, that would be one of those ways that it would be super clear, no yellows.
Right.
Okay, thank
So,
you.
so. If they're all under the authority of the administrative officer, then. You don't have that public review process, you don't have that discretionary review process, but you still need to have very clear. Objective standards that. Are easily applied, so there's not a question. In the mind of. You or anybody else is like, so did they do that or not? Did they satisfy this standard? You know, this is where, when we talk about things like Act 250 and other things, the character of the neighborhood standard. Well, what does that mean? Well, you defined the character of the neighborhood by defining the characteristics of
Mhm.
the zone, the building, the frontage, the yards, all of those. You've defined what is the character of the neighborhood. Have you met those objective standards?
And this is the same process for both 3 and 4.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for answering.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Last slide. So I mentioned this at the beginning that Linda and I have already started the process of conducting an audit of the existing standards, both in the form-based code in the village center district, following a format that the Northwest Regional Planning Commission used in doing some of this work for some of their member municipalities. So that will kind of ultimately allow you to see, okay, this is what the Zoning for Better Neighborhoods guide recommends in these different kinds of places. These are what your zoning standards currently are. Do they fit? Are there particular concerns about why they do or why they don't? And what ultimately will lead to then recommendations for specific changes that we'll recommend later in the spring. The other part of this is, again, the stakeholder engagement. Some of that is work that you will all do to just get feedback from the community about their experiences with the development review process and the development regulations in these places. What works, what doesn't work. My role is more specifically to target some specific stakeholders and get some more detailed comments, some of which I already have. Sarah mentioned that the Tateville project has already provided a fairly detailed list of questions and comments in the code, which is really helpful. I'll be looking to try to extract that kind of perspective from others. What did I miss, Linda?
What does it say on the bottom of your slide here? I can't scroll down that far.
We'll
This
be
is-
reporting back to the commission in early April.
Okay, great. That's what I thought it said.
Can I ask another process question? So do we look at those categories that you had on a previous slide, the main elements of the code? 3 and 4 at the same time? Are we gonna go all 4 and then all 3? You know what I mean? Are we gonna keep going back and forth between those 2 districts, or just take on 1 district at a time?
Well, in the audit, you're gonna kind of see them one by one. These are what the standards are versus what the guide's recommendations are for standards in these types of locations ought to be. But at some point, it may be useful to look at those, particularly those 2 districts, or probably all 3 of them side by side, given the fact that outside of the character districts is village center.
Mhm.
So how do these things line up? It might be actually useful, but just a matter of how we arrange the table to be able to see them in one space.
And then when we go to Warren, it's everything?
It's everything.
All together?
Yeah.
Yay.
I have a
It'll be lively.
request. I have a request on the audit. So you said at the very beginning that one of the main premises of zoning is health, safety, and welfare. And a lot of the outcomes that the form-based code is attempting to produce are walkable, safe, pleasant environments, because walkable, is healthy, and that's the welfare, and pleasant has economic benefit for the town. So I imagine like going through sort of line by line and saying, is this health, safety, and welfare? Meaning all the data shows that if the facade is engaging, then economic activity occurs, and this kind of use, a mixed use parcel, is more valuable than a vacant parking lot use, those kinds of things, as opposed to aesthetics and things that like, well, this is what we want, or this is what we like, or this is what we're comfortable with. I personally feel like it's hard to justify something unless we can really ground it back in like health, safety, welfare, economic development, community cohesiveness, like real values, because what we prefer can change depending on who you talk to. It can change over time. It can change based on, the economics of the business or the family or whatever. So the audit, to me, has to audit not just against the zoning guide, but also against those criteria.
And our town plan and the goals.
Yeah.
Well, to your point, Wendy, that's what you should be measuring this against, because it does go back to the purpose of zoning is to implement the town plan. The town plan says, these are our goals. This is what we want to have happen in these different parts of the town. So you need to make sure that the zoning is doing those things.
Right,
There's nothing in their town plan that says, we just want this to be pretty.
right.
We want these
Right.
things to serve these functions.
Right, so when people are like, well, what difference does it make if the window's, 5 feet or 6 feet or whatever? I'm assuming that the reason some of those specifications are there is because there's data and evidence that shows that, a building that's greater than 120 feet is not gonna engage the pedestrian, and so as long as that's true, as opposed to just being sort of arbitrary, or as opposed to arbitrarily trying to mimic what we already have.
I wonder if in doing the audit, right, I'm visualizing, like if you have a table, the audit's a table
Mhm.
against which you're using certain criteria, right? Like you're comparing. So that one of the columns for the criteria conforms with one of the goals of the town, and then the other column or something has the rationale, right? Is this about, and the rationale, health, safety, wellness, aesthetic,
Function.
right? Just
Yeah.
like, so that it's super clear, like the rationale behind this recommendation is based in the body of literature or a body of
Best
evidence
practice.
or best practice
Yeah,
related to something, so that it's just make what people say, it's like making the implicit explicit, like the why very, very explicit, and that would then give us more of the information that we would need in order to say yes, no, or keep or get rid of it because it conforms with the intentionality behind the town plan.
Mhm.
And the intentionality of less is more in terms of restriction. Like here's where it's really important to keep some kind of design feature versus that's just aesthetics and we're just gonna back away from it
Mhm.
or whatever.
Mhm.
So do you follow me?
I do follow you, and I do think we can incorporate something like that into the table, because it is an Excel
Right?
document. the
I
audit,
just think
yeah.
that would be like sort of that and
I think for, maybe not every single thing, but for
Big picture.
big
Yeah.
picture, yes.
yeah, because it just seems.
Why
to-
are we doing
Right, like
this?
why?
Why
Like
do we
what's
care?
the rationale behind it? I just feel like if you're going through all that detail already, just, making sure that you've captured that, because I know you know it.
Mhm.
It's just making it clear
Yeah.
for the rest of us, and then it's something that we can stand behind,
Right, clear for the
Well-
general public.
Okay,
right?
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
So I also wonder whether or not it, because we're following the enabling better communities through zoning guidebook, it includes a lot of that kind of perspective and information.
Excellent.
So that's where, you know,
Yeah.
we're measuring, what is this recommending? And we, in some places, we may recommend something different, but we can explain why. But why are these things important?
yeah.
Why are other things important? We can certainly kind of
Right.
highlight.
And I think, David, what I'm asking for is just instead of saying, well, this is because that's the guide says this.
Yeah.
It's getting at why did the guide say that in the first place, right?
Mhm.
That making that super explicit would be helpful.
No, I'm only just looking to not duplicate
Oh, 100%.
all the argument as to why are these different things important? And if
Right.
we can provide some reference to some resources that
Exactly.
provide that research and,
Yep.
you know, but everything else that goes into why is this stuff really important?
Yeah,
All right, I think we have to close this topic because we only have
Please.
10 more minutes and we have a couple things we have to do. So David, thank you very much.
Thank
Can I
you.
give you
Yes,
2 minutes? Quick.
How about 1 minute?
1 minute.
Yes.
David, I think I heard very clearly tonight that you're not including the commercial district in this
Correct.
review. I gotta place a huge complaint. That is possibly the most important piece of developmental potential for connectivity, use and function in the whole town of Jericho. It is in fact the center of Jericho. The villages, number one, the people really don't want you to develop them. Number two, going in there to do anything is going to be incredibly difficult, and it doesn't have the infrastructure there. And you've got some potential due to topography and infrastructure to actually accomplish something in my lifetime, which I would really like you to see, and you're walking right past it. That's number one. That's huge. Number two, most of this fantasy stuff. I worked on Columbia, Maryland, almost 60 years ago, the last major privately developed community. I worked for Connecticut General, which has become Cigna, and they were the private funding partner of incredible people, Roush Associates. This two-dimensional stuff doesn't work. Go to Burlington at 6:30, 7 o'clock in the morning. You can't get in there or out of there with trucks. You've got people who are trying to sleep that are disturbed. These things that are in 2 dimensions that look so cute and all that stuff are unlivable. They don't work. And if you don't have a massive public-private partnership to put all the infrastructure in, you're never going to permit this stuff. And that's when you're talking about simplicity. Where are you going to put all that stormwater? You got all these sloped things and you got all this and you got all that. Where's the stormwater going to go? One of the reasons why we like flat roofs is we capture the clean water up above all the pollution and we can put it into ponds. So the practical common sense that we employ when we actually build things is not present. And I want to give you a little history. The reason you have form-based code in Jericho came from outside the planning commission because it was a defensive move to hire a person who was not aware of anything about Jericho. There was virtually no input from Jericho. It was to defeat the owner of the property. So forget pretty much that you've got much of value in there. Mr. Tatro will give you a very short course if you take him offside, buy him a beer and ask him what he thinks of Jericho. Dropping 100, 125, and then finding out because it's 17 feet too wide, you can't build it.
Right. Okay.
Okay, so
Thank you very much.
I think you got to really rethink where you're going, because when we start sailing, we got to make sure we've got the degrees right.
Right.
We leaving here, I see you leaving the dock going in the wrong direction. Common sense, feasibility, practicality, and economics. You're not going to build anything at these prices if you don't make it crystal clear, practical, fundamental, and integrate all the resources. Good luck.
Okay. Okay, so we're done with that topic. Stephen, thank you very much. Okay, so town meeting. Is anybody planning to go to town meeting? Okay, so that would be there. And in the past, we've had a table at town meeting and, planning commission people are at the table, depending on what we were working on, we had like, you know, some visual aids or some handouts, or it was just nice to be a friendly face. The busiest time at town meeting is kind of between like, really like 8 and 9, 7:30 to 9:30 is kind of like the big frame. So if you're going, would you be willing to spend some time at a table? Yeah, okay.
I could spend time at a table.
Thanks,
Okay.
David.
And I think Linda, you were wondering like what would be good things to have? I think,
Yeah. With
Cookies.
the caveat that I do not have really any time to help support development of any materials, because I'm out of the office for a week or more before town meeting. That said, I do have a printed version of the town plan that can be at the table. I also have the tabletop cardboard stand-up thing that we had last year at the table, that if some people were willing to look at and maybe update in some way, shape, or form. I'm trying to remember what's on it. It might still be relevant.
Pieces of paper kind of taped up to it.
Yeah, it was like a cardboard, that piece of cardboard that was about this high, and it was like a trifold, so it had sort of like wings on the side. And
Sounds fair.
yeah, like a
Yeah.
science project. I'm trying to remember what was on it, because some of the stuff is probably still relevant, like
Yeah.
active projects.
And I will say, Chris, you and I were there last year. We didn't really talk to that many people.
No, we
We
did.
mostly talked to the engineer who's working on the wastewater stuff.
Okay,
So
I talked to some folks.
you did?
Yeah.
Okay, so maybe
Probably
you
talk
were,
like I
you were probably not friendly enough.
I mean, I didn't talk to dozens.
Yeah.
but maybe a half dozen.
Yeah.
it would be great to use it as an opportunity for outreach around the zoning update that we talked about tonight.
Mhm.
So if anyone was willing to create some one-pagers, I don't know how all of you are with graphic design or visual aids or any kind of content.
Can you ask him to distill it down to 2 printable PDF pages that you could just blow up and print bigger?
One of you could ask him. I will not be around.
What about like our 1 year time, our priority tasks, like doing the.
From getting it done.
From getting it done,
Mhm.
like if we had that out on the board, so folks can see what our priorities are.
Yeah, I agree.
That could be good, and that could come right out of the town plan
Yeah.
that already exists, so I think that would be easy.
One thing that seems to always gather a lot of attention, I won't be there to help, so I'm just throwing this out.
Mhm.
Having a zoning map
Oh,
and
people love
what's in each one of the zoning maps, showing also some of the overlays.
Yeah.
Here's what's in your town, these are the things we're working on. Maybe throwing up something about the character-based zone, what's there, what we anticipate, why it's there.
Mhm. I think
So, because people love maps.
I think there is a zoning map in the thing we had on the table last year. And I'm thinking too, something that could be easy would be printing some of the slides from David's presentation tonight, or from the presentation that I gave a couple of meetings ago. That would be really quick and easy, and all of that material is on the Google Drive. So easily
What about those
accessible.
Things we used at the workshop at the high school. And what was it, was in
Oh,
April
yeah.
or May, and we had all.
Um,
I was
Those
thinking-
drew a lot of attention.
Yeah,
You know, I
and you're
think,
right, there were the ones that were.
I think we
that
still
had
have
the
them.
zoning maps, the
And
maps
Yeah.
were
Overlays, the what, the.
super
I
popular.
know.
did we,
I'll get people to the.
do you remember where we put them after we took them down
That
from?
closet, right?
They
away.
might be in that
The
closet,
magic closet.
or they might be upstairs in the
Yeah.
upstairs.
I think the
closet.
issue is Linda's out of the office and I am away. And I won't be here for town meeting, so
Yeah,
I can't really, I won't be able to print anything or tape it onto the board or bring the board there or anything.
I will be here on the Monday before town meeting, but I don't know how much time I'll be able to allocate that day to
So
preparing.
what days do you two leave? Like, is it possible that before you vacate, you can find the existing materials that we used at that engagement? So what we used, if
Mhm.
those could be found beforehand. And so we could,
We can look in the closet before we walk. out
right,
the
like
door.
if we look.
Yeah, and we
There's
can look
not that many
upstairs.
Places they're
So
gonna.
if we
Yeah.
looked for that and then we printed out here's this is
We
what's
get
coming
it.
this year.
Getting it done, yeah.
Less is more.
Yeah.
I mean, that's
agree.
all
And
we
then a
need.
physical copy of the town
A
plan.
physical, that's all we need,
I like the getting it done and just blow it up
right?
big.
Because the get it done includes the character-based zoning as one of the.
That's true.
Right,
So it's just a talking point.
right, exactly.
All we need is a
Yeah.
talking point.
Yeah, okay.
So a map
it
and a getting
simple.
it done, that's all we need. Simple. Right? And then we just need,
Mhm.
here's how to get more information later, which is, somebody's email or, go to the town website, whatever it is, like,
Yeah, we
For
have
more
that QR
information.
code.
Yeah.
either website.
that's it.
Perfect.
Is this project on the Joy and Jericho site?
No, it doesn't have its own dedicated page yet. It will at some
Yeah.
point.
Yeah.
Mhm,
But if I'm gonna be there,
mhm,
which I am volunteering for,
okay.
the getting it done and a map,
Mhm.
it's all we need.
Even
Okay.
just a QR code.
And the town plan print
Yeah,
out,
yeah,
not, you know, it's just a nice,
Right.
Yeah,
But
impressive, beautiful document.
Yeah.
even just a QR code to get people to, if they come by and they say, oh, blah, 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 and be like, have you been to our website? Are you part of the email list?
Right.
We send out an
Exactly.
email every week and
Yeah.
here's what you should
Yeah.
find if you wanna be on it. That's how, a great way to stay connected. That'll prompt
Yeah.
you about what's going on and then you can read more.
yeah, seriously.
Sabina, will you be there?
I will be there, but I may have a conflict with the Conservation Commission needing somebody, so I can't commit at this point.
I have a question. Do we think it's necessary or appropriate for the planning commission to support the letter that the Affordable Housing Committee wrote regarding the reserve fund for the wastewater?
Is that gonna be, I was trying to pick up on that. Was that gonna be something that's read during town meeting? It's not an article.
Intention of that is to have the select board put that onto a floor vote because they did not include it in any of the budgeting that was put in there for the town. And the request is for $100,000 to be set aside for actions based upon the outcome of the wastewater study. Right now, there is nothing set aside for any action after that study is delivered.
It's actually not 100% true, which Linda helped clarify for me. So SJ read the letter from the Affordable Housing Committee to the select board at the select board meeting last Thursday. I was there. And that's what it says. It basically says the Affordable Housing Committee is requesting that the select board amend the budget and add in $100,000. I elected at the time not to go on the record in support of that action at the moment because we hadn't discussed it yet. And it's not on our agenda tonight either. But the reason is because, as Linda explained to me, the current grant, which we already have for the wastewater feasibility study, has a second phase with money already available, not allocated to us, but a pot that we can access in the future once the select board chooses a preferred alternative. So if in 2024, the select board chooses a preferred alternative, my understanding is that then we go, yay, we have our preferred alternative, and we go back to the pot of money and they say, great, you did what you were supposed to do. Now here's the next chunk of money, tranche of money. And this next tranche of money will cover the cost to pay for the next step of engineering and design. So we wouldn't be like
But
Oh,
if
dead
we're
on the
not sure of
water.
that,
It sounds like it is a pretty sure bet, right? As long as we make a decision and have a valid report and,
That is
I mean,
my current understanding
yeah,
of the program.
okay, not a
Yes.
guarantee, it's not in the bank, but it's extremely, if the fear is that all progress will stop, we can't do anything, nothing will happen, that's really
Well, I
not.
think there's two issues in my mind. There's that issue, and then there's also the issue of generating the start of public support and
Yes.
understanding of the
Correct.
importance of this issue.
And as Linda reminded me, and you can explain this if you rather than me, that we applied for the Leahy grant to have a public outreach campaign, and we were selected. So we will have money and resources and expertise and partners with another town or another group to help us do that. So what we need to do between now and the next town meeting budget, I came away thinking money was not the problem.
But I'm seeing it in a slightly different way. I think if the town sets aside money right now, it's an
True,
indication that this
True.
is
Of a
important.
commitment.
you're right.
We don't have
And
to
they-
spend it this year,
they-
but it's important.
They should have done it, they didn't do it. So the question is, do you want to make that argument now at the 11th hour? Or would you rather use our political capital, not throwing over that wheelbarrow at this moment in time and saying, we're gonna make the best of what we have, but God damn it, in the next budget, starting, in the summer, it's gonna be in there.
Yeah.
We have to start building. it.
I want to just interrupt process-wise. This isn't an item on the agenda tonight, and I'm concerned that there's discussion and potentially a decision that's being talked about being made to support or not support something that wasn't the topic on our agenda.
Right.
So, but
Can I put this under other business about updates from other committees? With a
We're not to other
diversity?
business
Okay.
yet.
Okay,
if
Okay,
I
so-
could just ask for clarifying, but there's nothing, we cannot decide as a group because we did not put it on the agenda, but we could speak as individuals, not representing the planning commission
At town
at
meeting.
town meeting in any way that we want to.
But can we also
Okay,
acknowledge a need to be more a part of the budget process so that this doesn't
Yes.
happen again?
100%.
And that's in the
We
town
were
plan.
already supposed to be doing that.
Yes.
Didn't, and
Yes,
so we just, we at least have to hold ourselves accountable to that.
yes. Yes,
Recognizing that we don't have this on the agenda, we cannot and we should not pass a resolution as a town planning commission. We should also in the future recognize that without commitment from the select board, that this funding would be a way for the select board to communicate very clearly
Exactly.
to the town that we are behind this.
Yes.
A year from now, we may end up saying, oh, look, there's another pot of money coming down the road. We know that at some point, the town of Jericho is gonna have to pony up a lot of money for this thing.
mhm.
And the sooner we can get that in people's minds, into their planning, on the select board agenda, the sooner we can start setting aside that money. Recognize that we can't vote on it, we shouldn't vote on it. I won't be able to raise it up on the floor, but if you can, I believe it will be beneficial for the town and for our achieving our objectives with the town plan.
okay. Anything
Now, the
else,
rest of it up to SJ, but she will.
anything else on town meeting and our participation in town meeting at our table? Okay,
We just need
Yeah.
somebody who's actually lead organizer, since the two of you are not going to be lead organizers.
I'm gonna do rock, paper, scissors. Two out of three.
Or you just want to take it.
right,
And then the thing that I'm worried about is I'm out of town Tuesday through Tuesday.
right.
I gotta come back or Monday
Monday
night.
night, right.
So.
Looks like it falls on Wendy by default.
Rock, paper, scissors.
I can give thought to it between now and Tuesday.
Okay.
And then
That's a
kind
whole-
of pass over. to-
Yeah,
Yeah, oh, we can,
Yeah.
I would,
it sounds like it's gonna be pretty simple.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Keep it simple.
Okay,
Um,
I'm happy to. vote.
okay, Linda,
Thank you. I just wanted to close that out without
Thank you.
having it
Great.
hanging.
is everybody okay to stay another 10 minutes?
Yeah, I just want to say that this late meeting is my fault because we ended the meetings before 9 earlier this year. So,
We had a band.
we should have seen this one.
It's not your fault. If you were running the meeting, we'd be
If I had
done.
filled that time
Right.
on those other days, maybe we could have been done.
Oh, okay.
Okay,
I'm going with second.
I'm gonna try to get through this quickly. So first update, regarding the zoning work that we talked about tonight. The next step will be April 2nd, when David will come back, and present with me the results of the zoning audit. So between now and then, he and I will be working on the audit. We'll be digging in really deep and getting in the weeds with all the zoning. So if any of you have specific things that are driving you crazy about the zoning that I should know about that we haven't talked about yet, or I need to have on my radar, definitely send me an email to get it on the list. Let's see, the wastewater project, the report is with the select board right now, the 60% report, and I thought we'd be able to review it at this meeting or maybe the next meeting, but they are still in their review process, and until they release it, it's an internal document. So stay tuned on that. We'll get that on the meeting as soon as we can. The other exciting update is around the UVM Leahy grant for the wastewater outreach. I had a couple meetings with the partners that we're going to be involved with on that project. The main one being the Wyndham Regional Commission, and then the staff at UVM that are going to be helping us with the project. And it does seem like it's a foregone conclusion that it's going to get approved, which is very exciting. And if it is approved, Jericho will be getting an intern, it sounds like, that will work with us to develop the outreach strategy that I think will be very successful at using Jericho as an example community of that has wastewater need and is trying to figure out all of these financial pieces and how to put it together and the messaging and all of that. I think it's going to be a huge asset for us to be working on that in partnership with the Wyndham Regional Commission, who's doing a statewide GIS mapping project about wastewater. And they were tasked with reaching out to get letters of support from like the Secretary of the Agency of Natural Resources and like some very prominent and high level state staff. So I think this grant and this opportunity is going to be a key driver for support, getting more support for the potential wastewater project. So I'm excited about that. The path, the Jericho Corners to Riverside Path meeting that we had last week. The select board didn't choose a preferred alternative yet. So I don't have an update, a specific update yet on that. But it was a good meeting. There were a lot of people that participated. So we will ask the select board to revisit it within a month or two. And it seemed like they were understanding the feedback and digesting all the comments, and I felt encouraged at the end of it. The engineer was fantastic, answering all the questions, and the public comment went on for hour and a half, maybe. So there's definitely a lot of engaged people in that project. And I'll just want to share something about the cost of a wastewater facility. I was talking with my good friend today who is managing the wastewater project in the town of Waitsfield. And he was telling me that they are positioned to fund their project completely without increasing taxes. And I can tell you more about the dynamics of it, but it's a relatively complicated funding stack. But their project is $15 million.
Wow.
Wow, that's impressive.
Yeah.
That's encouraging.
Yeah.
How far along are they?
They are in the final engineering phase.
What's the relative population compared to ours that would be using the system?
I think, well, so depends on what system we end up choosing here. They're doing one system to support 2 adjacent villages. And I think it was 300 users.
300 households?
I think so.
Can I respectfully request that we put this on the agenda for the next meeting to get a little bit deeper dive? As I'm seeing like a lot of excitement and wanting to ask a lot of questions, and
And it's late.
it's really late. So, but could you give us like a little presentation on it next time? If it's appropriate?
maybe.
Know enough to talk about it.
Yeah.
I don't know enough right now, and my friend who's managing the project is about to go on a 3-month sabbatical, so I don't know if I'll be able to
Okay.
connect with him.
Mhm.
Maybe the right timing for that is
But-
when we actually
Yeah.
get to
Yeah.
get the
Yeah.
60% report
Yeah.
on our agenda.
Yeah, and what I would maybe like to do is if he'd be willing to
Okay,
for
so
him to come
that'd be
here and
awesome.
talk about
That'd be
Or
awesome.
even just.
what they did,
present
or on Zoom or something.
Yeah.
Yeah,
When is the 60% report going to be done?
it's done.
When can we see it?
She said
Uh,
that earlier. She said they are not releasing it yet.
The select board is reviewing it.
If you wanna call your select board members and let them know how you feel about its importance. As a citizen.
I
you
may
may
very
do
well
that.
do that.
I may do that.
I'd like to read it.
I'm seeing Sabina's face, which leads me to believe she has something
She has
to say.
Super.
I just wanted to highlight how important I think it is to elevate that fact of what you just said, Linda, to the public as to in as much extent as possible, meaning there's so much dialogue about how we can't do this and we can't do that and we can't do this because of the wastewater is going to cost too much and we got to buy the garage. And I feel like decisions are being made on information that is unknown and from what you're saying, probably inaccurate. So, we have to flip that mentality, and the sooner we get the opportunity to start that conversation and say, you know what? It's not necessarily going to raise our taxes, and it's not necessarily going to be a huge financial burden. And so we really need to leave everything on the table and not say no, 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 because we have these dark clouds hanging over our head. So
Amen.
Yeah.
Well, that could be part of the messaging that comes from our intern and our outreach strategy.
Right, but I agree with you, Sabina, in the who grabs the microphone sets the tone. There's something, I'm
Right.
saying exactly the wrong words, but you understand what
Yeah.
I'm saying.
Yeah.
It's like who gets to frame the message.
Right.
And if we yield that for too long, we'll be playing catch up.
Okay, anything else, Linda?
No, that's it.
How about any other planning commission updates from anyone?
I just have one liaison update, which are from the DEI committee who's been sponsoring the vote on town meeting, with articles 6 and 7 about shall Jericho move to Australia, and ballot for budget questions and public questions. And it has to be a floor vote. Ironically. But I just wanted to put that out there, let folks know that it's on the ballot. There will be a floor vote on it. And that's my one update. If there are people that you know that can attend, that would be awesome.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else? All right, so the next meeting, I think Linda and I were thinking that it would be fine to not meet on March 5th. Is everybody good with that? On town meeting day. And then, March 19th, we don't yet have an agenda, but we have a couple of ideas in the queue.
Yeah, I mean, that could be the meeting where we do all of our admin stuff, electing a chair, clerk, I had on here a debrief from town meeting, so
Mhm.
if people didn't attend, we could kind of talk about what happened there. Depending on what happens with the wastewater report, maybe the wastewater report.
Okay.
Those are some of
anything
the
else
topics.
before-
Susan, Peter has his hand up. He's had it up kind of intermittently for a while now. So
Okay, sure, thank you, Sabina. Peter,
I've been putting it up and down, trying to find the right place to not interrupt the conversation.
okay, sorry.
And I failed because now I've interrupted the conversation. But it sounds like a bunch of you are not going to be at town meeting, and I just wanted to encourage you to consider voting early through absentee ballot if you would like to try to get the select board to move in a direction that is that shares your vision. So I just wanted to, a lot of you aren't going to be there, and wanted to just let you know that you should think about absentee ballots beforehand.
Okay,
I put mine in the box
great,
today.
yeah, Eric just already did it today, so,
Vote early, vote often.
right. Okay, executive session not required. Motion to adjourn. You get them first, you gotta go first.
Motion to adjourn.
Okay, Wendy, motion to adjourn.
Second.
Chris, thank you.
Aye.
Aye.
All those in favor of adjourning? Aye.
I.
Nancy and Tom from MMC TV, thanks for hanging with us a little bit.
Oh, my
late
goodness.
this evening.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. All
Thank you.
right, thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Good night.
Bye, everyone.